Welcome to Relationscapes, the podcast where we explore the complicated landscapes of relationships, gender, sexuality, race, and more. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and our guide in this episode about conversion therapy is Lucas Wilson.
Once folks started really catching on to how dangerous these practices are, but also how ineffective they are when a number of the leaders of this movement were found out to be, behind closed doors or, at gay bars, whatever, doing, things that they quote unquote should have been doing, they lost a lot of credibility.
Being gay is a sinful disease. At least that's what Lucas Wilson and millions of others were taught growing up in conservative Christianity. The church didn't just diagnose them, it also promised a cure. They said healing and salvation was possible through something called conversion therapy. But as Lucas and other survivors reveal in his book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, that cure wasn't therapy at all. It actually caused deep psychological and spiritual harm. Behind the false promises and extreme tactics of the ex-gay movement were leaders whose own hypocrisy was exposed for the world to see. The ex-gays were still gay. Every major medical association has condemned conversion therapy as dangerous fraud. 25 states have banned its practice, including here in conservative Utah. And yet, as I record this in 2025, conversion therapy is staging a comeback. The Supreme Court's conservative majority is likely to overturn those bans, threatening to breathe new life into a practice that Lucas says was never about healing, it was about control. Lucas Wilson joins us right now to talk about the witness accounts he documents in his book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy. Lucas Wilson, welcome to Relationscapes.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So we're talking about conversion therapy, and you're not just someone who studied conversion therapy, you've actually gone through a type of conversion therapy yourself. And I wondered how it feels for you to talk about that more personally, because you can approach it like a scholar, but this is very personal to you. So what does it feel like to be talking about the book?
Yeah, I don't really, I don't really struggle with talking about my experience. I think for a lot of folks who underwent conversion therapy that they were in a definitional sense traumatized by their experience. And I don't know if I can say that I was traumatized, not to say that it wasn't difficult, not to say that it wasn't damaging, because both of those descriptors would be accurate. But traumatizing in a clinical sense doesn't necessarily map onto my experience. So for me, although it's something that is, tough, it was tough to go through, I would say that now it's something that I have both enough distance and I've done, I would like to think enough, emotional and sort of, intellectual work on the topic to, come to terms with what happened to me in a very literal sense, right? Like to come to terms, to find terms or to find language to describe what happened, I think is the first step. And for me, I did have the privilege of going through graduate school and writing and thinking about this topic, extensively. So it really did give me the time and it gave me the space to think through and to feel through a lot of what happened. But for me now, my experience, I talk about it all the time. It's something that I've talked about in an academic sense, but also again in a personal sense on different podcasts and YouTube channels and radio stations, that kind of stuff. And so at this point, it's something that is just part of my story. And it is exactly that, part of my story, not my whole story. And it's not who I am. It's just, part of what happened to me and part of my history. And so I wouldn't say that it's all that difficult at this point, especially just the fact that I talk about it so often. But again, this is not to take away from the fact that this is a damaging, death-dealing practice that hurts a lot of people. And for a lot of folks, it is a traumatizing experience. I just can't say that for myself. And I'm quite glad that I can't say that for myself for obvious reasons, right? Like you don't want that to be something that, defines your experience, that being trauma.
Well, I wonder if it gave you any sort of survivor's guilt about it at all, in a sense of like, now you've learned about other people who have had it worse. Did you ever have to reckon with those kind of feelings?
Yeah, I don't know if I've had that. I mean, I think that, both researching the topic and specifically writing this book or editing this book, I should say more accurately. The book is a collection of 17 stories written by conversion therapy survivors, one of whom is me. And then I wrote the introduction, which is, an academic approach, albeit in a very accessible format, a discussion of the history and the practices of conversion therapy. And so for me, doing that research, realizing the breadth of experiences, realizing that my experience is not the only one, and seeing, oh gosh, this happens here, here, and here, whether it be a religious context or a secular context, whether that be in a group setting or an individual setting with a pastoral counselor or, a licensed therapist, whatever it might be, and also even in familial context, right? Right. So I think all of these different experiences showed me that, researching the topic and seeing this in the literature allowed me to realize that my experience wasn't the only one. And seeing that, some folks had it really, really bad, right? Like there are a number of folks that I know, they're not included in the collection, but a number of folks I know who underwent electroshock therapy. Thank God that wasn't my experience, right? There wasn't that physical, in a painful sense experience for me. There was instead, there were physical aspects, we can talk about that later, but it wasn't like that for me. So hearing that and reading about that is certainly, I don't know if I would say I have survivor's guilt. I would just say that I am, I feel awful for the people who experience that.
Before we dive in then to your direct experience, let's define conversion therapy in general. How do you define it? What are the parameters of it for your book and for your studies?
Yeah, so there are different names for conversion therapy. Really, at this point, one of the main sort of terms that's used, instead of just conversion therapy, talking about it in a greater sense or a broader sense, conversion practices. Conversion practices are definitionally the attempt to change an individual's sexual orientation or someone's gender identity or gender expression. And so, if anything, if someone is, again, it's not just what happens in a church basement or just what happens behind closed doors in a pastor's office. This happens in a multiplicity of contexts, right? And so it's efforts to see that someone's gender sexuality be changed because they believe that someone's gender sexuality is dirty, is damaged, is, sinful. And again, we can use a number of descriptors, but that there's a negative understanding.
Unnatural.
A state of unnatural sort of like orientation or identity or expression, exactly. And so I think that really it's seeing someone's non-normative in the sense of not being the norm, sexuality or gender, as wrong, and trying to change that, to fix that, quote unquote, to align it with the heteronormative model.
Yeah, and that can include things you say like talk therapy, support groups, prayer practices, forced celibacy, aversion therapy, which is introducing like electroshock would be in there where they're, if you get excited or if you get turned on, then they'll shock you, using terrible smells, also exorcism and other religious practices. And as you said, it can span the secular to the religious. It's not necessarily confined to one or the other category. It sort of transcends those categories.
Yeah, and I won't name the university, but I was recently asked to do a teach-in at a university in North America. And the reason I was asked was because there were students in this program, a counseling program, and it's a really prominent university, which is all the more troubling, that they have identified a number of the classes that have been teaching conversion practices, albeit masked as medical care. And of course, conversion therapy is not medical care. Conversion therapy is not care. It is damaging pseudoscience, right? That has been debunked for a very long time. That harms the folks that it is, trying to fix, quote unquote. And so I think that, again, we oftentimes think of conversion practices as something, of the past, that it's no longer happening, which is a myth. It is continuing to happen, and it happens actually at an alarming rate within ecclesial or church context. But on top of that, it's not just the religious, conservatives that are doing this, though, of course, I will say that disproportionately it is happening within religious spaces. But what I will also say is that it is happening, again, in a number of other contexts, particularly medical or counseling contexts. It's just that either the folks who are practicing it don't know what they're, practicing in the sense of, oh, this falls under the umbrella of conversion practices, or they do, and that's all the more terrifying.
I mean, the irony to me is, as you talk about, LGBTQ plus communities have gained a lot of social acceptance and civil rights over the past several decades, and the progress has been uneven. We have a long way to go, but there's been an increase in acceptance of queer people that's not guaranteed to continue. And it seems like the efforts of conversion therapies and practices can intensify the more being gay is accepted, because then like the pressure's on even more to like, oh, we need to stem this tide. So instead of conversion therapy just sort of disappearing, it can almost intensify or become even more urgent the more gay people are accepted in society.
You know what? I think that's absolutely true. And a big part of it is that in the past, like the ex-gay movement, which really was at its peak in, like the 90s into the 2000s as well. But the ex-gay movement was trying to go mainstream. They were trying to make it so it wasn't just religious crackpots who were out there practicing conversion therapy, and also those who were, undergoing conversion therapy. They tried to make it something that, they were advertising in major, newspapers, on billboards and all this kind of stuff. They were trying to make it, seen and visible. However, once folks started really catching on to how dangerous these practices are, but also how ineffective they are, when a number of the leaders of this movement were found out to be, behind closed doors, or, at gay bars, whatever, doing, things that they quote unquote should have been doing. They lost a lot of credibility, right? And Wayne Beeson is really the person who was exposing a lot of these folks. Truth Wins Out is his organization, and he does fabulous work. And so once we got into the 2000s, and again, social understandings and cultural understandings and societal understandings of queer communities was changing. And again, we see in Canada, 2005, gay marriage is legalized. We see in 2015 in the US, the gay marriage is legalized. So you see that, cultural acceptance of queer communities was codified in law. And of course, that changes how public opinion, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing was that, once we, again, like to your point, homophobia and transphobia were no longer in vogue the way that they were before, or at least socially normalized, we started seeing, again, conversion practices go into the dark. And so they were going to be, again, into spaces where people weren't able to see them, at least easily. And so what happened was that they started using a lot of euphemistic language, dog whistles, right? For those of us who have our ear to the ground, which is, pastoral counseling, biblical worldview counseling, whatever, dog whistle they wanted to use. They were doing this behind closed doors. And so, yes, I think 100% these communities, the ex-gay movement, really went underground in a way, or at least just not in the public spotlight or the public purview. Instead was going into these mega churches where people were sharing, ex-gays were sharing their testimonies. The Changed movement out of Redding, California, Bethel, the church, there's a big church and campus, and or college, whatever you want to call it, if we can even call that a college, but this whole sort of culture out there, that they started the Change movement, where again, it's just not saying, oh, we're not the ex-gay movement, we're the Change movement, which again, if you first look at, the Change movement, you don't know what that is. If you see the ex-gay movement, you're like, oh, I think we know what that means, right? And so
it's a good rebrand.
Exactly. And so it's just gone underground. And I think that makes it all the more terrifying, because it's, a crime. And for instance, in Canada, conversion therapy is illegal. And so up until the nationwide ban, conversion, therapists were out there advertising their services, if we can call those services. And, not all of them, but again, still some of them had already started changing their language. But once the conversion therapy ban was put in place, these organizations were forced to go underground. And, like all crime just goes underground when, you can't do something, you just do it behind closed doors. You do it in the shadows. And that's what's happened with conversion practices in a lot of these places, especially since either if it's illegal or if it's just not, socially acceptable or societally acceptable to do these things. They just change the language, but continue to do what they do, albeit just in a more obfuscated or masked fashion.
Has anyone been making a harm reduction argument against making conversion therapy illegal? The idea that, hey, this needs to be legal so it can be regulated, and if we make it illegal, then it does just go underground. Is anybody making that legal argument to try to protect conversion therapy legalization?
Not that I know of. I mean, there have been different approaches to banning conversion therapy, whether it be in a nationwide ban or a provincial or state ban or a municipal ban. And so, if we're thinking about the Jonah case out in, I believe it was New Jersey.
This is a ultra-Orthodox Jewish group, Jonah.
Yeah. And this group, the approach that the folks who were going against Jonah was Ferguson v. Jonah, but Michael Ferguson and the other class action lawsuit plaintiffs, they were using the approach of consumer fraud, right? That you're promising a service that doesn't work. And so if you're saying that this works and it doesn't work, and we know that it doesn't work, then you shouldn't be doing this, and they won. So that was one approach, right? There are other approaches where this is just, again, definitional abuse. According to the UN Rapporteur on Torture, this is torture, right? So if we're talking about, abuse, or if we're talking about torture, if we're talking about damaging practices, like every single legitimate medical and professional society or organization or association has condemned these practices, right? And so when all of the medical community, when all of the, psychological and community, and again, pick your community, when they've all condemned it, I think that's reason enough to say no or to ban these practices. So when all of these different organizations have been, the evidence that they've come up with, the arguments that they've come up with have been used to say, this is harming people, this shouldn't happen. That's really been the approach for a lot of different bans, whether they be, again, nationwide, municipal, or state, or provincial.
And we might as well mention right now, as we're talking about this, the Supreme Court just announced in the United States that it would take up a case from Colorado that is challenging the state law there that prohibits conversion therapy. And they're going to take this case up to decide whether states can restrict conversion therapy. So it's on the radar right now. What are you thinking about the possible outcomes? I know you're in Toronto, so and people might have picked up you saying a boat and things like this. So like you're up there in Canada, so as you're looking down at the United States here, who apparently you might be joining us soon, right?
That's
as
it.
the 51st state. So yeah. But what are you thinking of the American landscape as you know they're taking up this case?
Well, first of all, I can never hide from my accent. It's always. I remember when I moved to the U.S. when I was for a lot of schooling, and I remember I tried to hide my accent. I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to like hide my accent, neutralize it, make it so they can't hear me. And then I think it really backfired because when I came home, my sister, she looks at me and she goes, "What the hell?" She goes, "Why are you talking like that?" I said, "Like what?" She says, "Your accent's so strong," and I was like, "Shut up." It obviously didn't work. Anyway, so I'm still
No, I fixed it. I converted
That's it. I did give it a good old college try, right? It was so I was not very effective at changing my sexuality or gender, but I was apparently able to change my accent and just thicken it. I don't know. So thinking about the Supreme Court, I'm terrified about that.
Yeah, me too.
What's going to happen, because I don't think it's going to turn out well. I mean, even when, I believe it was 2019, there was a case that was proposed to go before the Supreme Court, and it was struck down. They said no, but three of the justices at the time said that they would have taken up the case. And of course, what they're saying is that they would, make conversion therapy legal without saying it. And so this time around, I mean, again, there have been some surprises recently with the Supreme Court, but the surprises have not been the majority. And so there's always the possibility, right, that this could turn out favorably, but I just don't see that happening. I see this to be a backdoor way of legalizing conversion therapy nationwide. And I think that it's something that, even with the Alliance Defending, Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF, who's bringing forth the case, Kristen Wagner, what they're saying is that they shouldn't allow the state to, impose their views on free speech and limit free speech based on their political or, ideological views. And of course, that's exactly what they're doing. That's exactly what these conversion therapists are doing. They're trying to mask their work, which again is definitional conversion therapy or conversion practices, as medical care, and conversion practices have never been medical care and they never will be medical care, and all the science supports that.
Yeah, and it conflates medical care with speech too. They're trying to make a free speech argument, but these are practices. I know there's gray areas there. I get that, but it can't be simplistically framed as you're restricting our freedom of speech. They're free to say that being gay is wrong or that you should want to change it. What they're not free to say is we have this path that will work for you when it doesn't work, and when it's very, very harmful for most people who go through it.
Right, and that's the thing, right? It's not free speech; it's conduct, and it's professional conduct. And although you might be a medical doctor, you might be a counselor, you might have beliefs about whatever, that those beliefs cannot interfere with your practice. And exactly that, it's practice. Yeah. It's conduct.
Yeah, if I'm a medical doctor and I believe that like jumping in a pool of suntan lotion will cure your cancer, and I start introducing that and I'm billing and I'm selling that to the public, it would be right for the state to come in and say, this person's a crackpot, this doesn't work. You can't use your medical license to advance this therapy that doesn't work. You can't do that. It's
just crazy, right? And they're trying to legislate, again, abuse as medical care. And again, no one should ever have to go through therapy after going through therapy, right? Again, quote unquote therapy. Conversion therapy is not therapy.
Double therapy.
You know what I'm saying? And so I think that, like, again, people say, like, well, shouldn't people be able to consent to, again, what they're saying, what they're calling free speech, what we're calling more accurately medical practice or medical conduct. You shouldn't be able to consent ever to abuse, right? Like, that's not something that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, but again, I just have no hope for what's going to happen with the Supreme Court. I hope that,
well, we're on the same page there.
It's terrifying. And I think that I think we know the conclusion of what's going to happen, but we have our fingers crossed.
Well, it's frustrating too, because here in Utah, the state of Utah outlawed conversion therapy in a surprising move. It's a very conservative state. Salt Lake City, where I live, is quite liberal. It's a blue dot in a red state, but it took a real coalition of conservatives to make this happen, because here in Utah, conversion therapy had borne such poisonous fruit. And so it's sad to me that a conservative state like Utah could have made such positive progress only to see the federal government step in and take that progress away. So on a local level, it hurts. And then also to think about how that could spill over into other countries. I think of like how the UK has the Cass report about transgender people, right? And it's a very problematic report. It makes very inaccurate claims about trans care, especially for young people. And then we have people in the United States, conservatives, pointing to that and saying, oh, look at that. See, even they're doing it. So, and I'm afraid of the United States being an example to other countries. So I don't know how firm it is in Canada, but I would worry about Canada, like conservative or reactionary folks in Canada saying, well, the United States just made it legal. What are we doing? We need to follow suit. So I'm also afraid of the ripple effects.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's the thing, right? Like, this is not these practices are not specific to the U.S. Though the ex-gay movement really did sort of balloon in the U.S. and it did. Like, yes, Australia had conversion therapy groups before, and yes, they have a strong sort of like contingent there who promote and practice conversion therapy. The U.S. really is sort of like the birthplace of these practices when it comes to a very religious approach. However, these, like you said, these practices have been exported, right? Why would Canada have to have a nationwide ban if it weren't for the fact that this was happening in Canada? And then you go to other countries, right? Like, if you go specifically, like you said, different, Western countries, but again, this is something that is happening across the nation. This is a global movement, and there are global connections that really are terrifying because this movement really does have a lot of money. And we see the effects in other countries, whether it be Uganda or, the UK, Brazil, etc., right?
That's Lucas Wilson. He's an interdisciplinary scholar of history, religion, and literature. And we're talking about his book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. Let's talk about your experience, Luke. You were at Liberty University. This is a conservative Christian university in the United States. And you found that, you might have wondered when you got there if you were the only gay guy on campus, but you found that wasn't true. Tell me about your experience at Liberty and what you went through.
You know what? I always had this big plan. My big plan was that I was going to go to Liberty. And once I got there, I just kind of assumed that there were other gays because I was gay. And so I thought, when I get there.
Okay, so you figured, okay.
Well, this is it. I had this, like, I was always sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Though I always say now, I was more 1 foot in this, tomfoolery of liberty and evangelicalism. But I did have 1 foot in, 1 foot out because I didn't come from a Christian home. I came from an agnostic. My dad was agnostic. My mom was sort of haunted by her Baptist demons. But at the end of the day, it wasn't really a religious home. We didn't talk about God. Like, we went to church when I was really young. And then we would, whenever we did go, you'd come home from church and you'd shut the hell up about Jesus. You didn't talk about Jesus, and that was sort of it. And so I didn't really have a religious background. So I think that I always had a little bit of critical distance and a critical awareness outside of the church, which I'm very thankful for. But when I was planning to go to Liberty, I did know that they had a conversion therapy program, and I did want to go to Liberty because of that conversion therapy program. But I said to myself, when I get there, I'm going to go have fun with Christian guys because, I didn't want to be a bad witness in high school to the non-Christian, gay guys. I didn't want them to think, oh, aren't you a Christian? And yet you're going on a date with me. I didn't want to have that sort of bad PR for Jesus. So I thought to myself, when I get to Liberty, I'm going to go and I'm going to, date Christian boys. And then once, maybe my senior year comes around, I'll go to conversion therapy. And I didn't call it conversion therapy. I just called it like pastoral counseling. And I would go fix it, find a wife, any wife will do, and then go back to Canada and, the rest would be history. So that plan certainly didn't work out. I got to Liberty, and about 2 weeks into my time there, on every dorm, there were 2 resident advisors, under them 2 spiritual life directors, and under them a bunch of prayer leaders. And then under them, the rest of us, plebeians who weren't, spiritual enough to be on leadership. So I had one of my spiritual life directors, he made a move. And I, of course said yes. And then afterwards, he wouldn't talk to me. Like, he sort of like excommunicated me. And I became so sad. Like, I've never really been a sad boy, but I was a sad boy then. Because he wouldn't talk to me.
Yeah.
It's your first like romantic, if we can call it romantic experience.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he doesn't talk to me. So I was distraught. I was like so sad because I, didn't have anyone I could talk to. I was on a campus where if anyone found out what I did, I could either be fined or expelled. And I was terrified that they were going to tell my mom because, knowing Liberty, I was like, I would only expect that they would. And so I was, sad. And so I fast-tracked my plan, and I decided that I was going to go meet with this pastor on campus who I knew about, who worked with 2 groups of students, those who were quote-unquote addicted to porn, you can't be addicted to porn. And those who are addicted to homosexuality, you can't be addicted to homosexuality. Neither of these things, there's no science to back this up. Anyway, this is something, an article I'm working on right now, but that's besides the point. All this to say, I knew about this guy whose name was Pastor Dane Emmerich, and he was a paid university employee who was tasked with working with these two groups of students. And I think it was largely because he said he wanted to work with them. Now, looking back and knowing a little bit more about him, I can understand why he wanted to work with us, because he was a quote unquote ex-gay who was married with children and grandchildren. And I think this was his outlet in some ways to sort of live vicariously through the queers on campus. So I went to this pastor, and for 4 years, I went through his one-on-one conversion therapy program. I only went once to his group program, and that's actually what I talk about. I write about that group experience in the book Shame, Sex, Attraction.
Yeah, it wasn't the coolest group. It seemed like you got there and was like, oh, I don't know how I fit in here.
Well, that was it. We can fast forward to the group, because the group was after a few years of being in the one-on-one program. The group program, you always wondered, like, who's in that group? Hopefully it's a bunch of handsome guys. And when I got to the group, it was like mostly the guys that you kind of expected to be there who you didn't find cute. And then on top of that, like, it was just a bunch of, just like really, and sad. It was like a sad group. You walked in, you're like, oh my God, like, look at this. And so nonetheless, there was one guy that I met, and that's what the story in part is about. But putting the groups aside, the one-on-one program was, I think it really does map onto a lot of folks' expectations for what conversion therapy is, that it really aligns with what a lot of people would assume is conversion therapy. And so for me, that was meeting with this pastor on a really regular basis for over the span of my 4 years. And we talked, it was talk therapy. So in the beginning, it was this pseudo-Freudian approach to human sexuality, right? Where it was like, what was your relationship like with your mom, with your dad, with your brothers, with your sister, with your, friends, whoever.
Wouldn't it be like, if your mom was too close to you, that made you gay? Or if your dad was like too distant from you, then that made you gay? Like, they would find these family dynamics that caused it. Right?
That was it. And it was like an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? Where it was like, take what works and leave what doesn't, and so for me, my mom was overbearing. My mom was wild and crazy. Cheryl's a wild human. But my dad was like arguably much more involved in my life than my mom. And my dad was just phenomenal, and I was very close to him. And so
see, that should have offset made you not gay.
That's it. I should have been at least bisexual, but that didn't work. And so that we started with that, and then we would talk about those relationships and sort of hash them out. And it always came back to that too, right? It was, again, always going back to, your relationship with your mom, and you're always doing this with your mom, and something with your dad, with that kind of stuff. And so that conversation then sort of fed into the rest and framed the rest of our meetings, which every time we would meet, we would, read parts of scripture. We would I had this manual. Mine was Alan Medinger's Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey. That's my conversion therapy manual. I still had a copy, or I still had my copy, but I lost it in a move, and I'm still very ticked off about that. But anyway, so that book was, again, framed our conversations. And then he would pray for me every time. I never prayed for myself, which I think is quite indicative of, the conversion practices, that he was interceding on my behalf, not me speaking for myself, but neither here nor there. And then we always talked about my slip-ups and my victories. So every week we would talk about my slip-ups, times I gave into temptation, and then my victories, times I overcame temptation. We're like,
Now, would they get specific about this, like talking to you about like just lustful thoughts, like masturbation? Like, were they talking about pornography? And if, you're nodding your head, was there shame attached to that? Like, as you're talking about it, was there a sense of like, oh gosh, I actually feel really gross about myself? Because I've read accounts where that really can be damaging. And other people are just kind of take it sort of like a personal growth thing of, I kind of messed up there. And, it depends on the person, right? How was it for you when you're talking about those really personal things to this person?
Yeah. So to answer the first question, it was like incredibly detailed. Like, he asked very invasive questions and very personal questions about like, so what kind of porn do you like? So like, when do you masturbate?
Yeah,
like, why do you masturbate?
Very sus.
Oh my gosh. Looking back, like at the time, again, like I was so evangelical, and evangelicals have no understanding of what it means to be, to have personal boundaries. We'll share everything. We'll tell you everything.
Confess.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so it's this culture of like breaking down walls and barriers and having none of those. And then ultimately, of course, that's incredibly dangerous for like mental well-being and emotional well-being, and in a lot of cases, physical well-being. But all this to say is that I was in this culture. I was a part of this culture that really prioritized and privileged you sharing everything. And so there were no limits to what I shared, and I shared everything. And looking back, it's so bizarre and it's so creepy, everything that I told this man and how he would sit there and listen and talk to me. But to answer the second part of your question, the shame, was there shame involved then? And my answer for that is, at the time, no. And in fact, Dane has on the record explicitly, Pastor Dane, my conversion therapist, has explicitly said that his goal, and I do believe that he is well-intentioned. Again, good intentions don't always take us to the best places, but he was well-intentioned, that he was actually trying to get rid of the shame for us, in the sense that within evangelicalism, homosexuality is oftentimes framed as the worst sin, right? It is considered like the epitome of, the byword of, sinfulness and depravity. And so for him, he was trying to work against those years and years and years of us being taught, whether it be explicitly or implicitly, that being gay or struggling with homosexuality or same-sex attraction, as he put it, was bad, was really wrong. And again, he did believe it was wrong.
Yeah, like God's going to come and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah kind of a thing. Like it's the worst, grossest thing. And that's interesting. So he knew you'd internalize that. And he's like, one of the steps I want to take is to get rid of that. It's still bad, he was saying. Being gay is still bad, but we need to like take the edge off almost. Take some ibuprofen.
That was it. And so I think that he was trying to like defang how we understood ourselves. And so there was a reframing. So it wasn't that he wanted us to feel ashamed of ourselves, even though the rest of Christianity absolutely scripts you into being ashamed of everything and every part of your being that is in alignment. But with him, he was trying to take away the shame. He was trying to instead replace it with guilt. And if we can differentiate guilt and shame by way of saying, okay, so guilt is like if you're in the court of law and you've stolen something, you're not a bad person. You just did one bad thing, and we're going to slap you in the wrist, give you a $5 fine, and then you're going to go on your way. And you're not going to think of yourself as bad or a thief. You stole something once, but that doesn't define you. Now, shame is where it's not just that I've done something bad, it's that I am bad. It's where the action is internalized, or that the negative emotion attached to the action, the bad action, is internalized and understood in the context of you yourself are bad, you yourself are dirty, you yourself are, deranged or whatever. And so he was trying to get rid of that understanding of ourselves and say instead, well, whenever you have a slip up, whenever you have, a moment where you give into temptation, that's not defining you, that's just defining that moment. And I think in part this was a way of him, because they always said that we weren't gay. We weren't like, we didn't have a homosexual orientation.
That's not your identity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was a way of separating the individual from the action. So saying, you're not gay. Yeah. You're just struggling with same-sex attraction. So I think it all worked together where, yes, he was trying his best to separate the shame, because there obviously are a lot of negative consequences for that. But on top of that, he was really trying to reorient how we understood ourselves. And so what I always say, though, is that although he was trying to get rid of the shame and instead replace it with guilt, which again, like, I love that was his job, right? Like, to guilt us. But to replace that, he was, obviously wasn't effective, because what happened for me was that, yes, when I was at Liberty, every time I'd go and talk with him, it almost felt like, in some ways, Catholic confession, where you go and you say, oh, I've done this, and you ask the Catholic priest to forgive you. I never asked Dane to forgive me, because within Protestantism, I talk to God directly.
Yeah.
And so but every time I did feel some sort of absolution, I felt a little bit like, well, you know what, that was just, me struggling in the moment. I feel better. However, when I graduated and I no longer had Dane and I was out in the world and I started to realize, things aren't changing. Oh goodness. I wouldn't have said, because you're not supposed to swear. But you're
not supposed to.
No, that's not okay. So I would say, oh gosh, I'm not changing. And I wasn't changing, obviously, because like,
gee willikers.
She is. And so it was like this, I no longer had that sort of outlet to get rid of those negative feelings, that guilt. So I started to realize, okay, it's not just that I struggle with same-sex attraction in the sense of I'm dealing with it on an individual, like, discrete basis where, okay, here, and here. I started realizing, well, I'm gay. I'm not what I thought I was. And I always thought within, and I think within evangelicalism, you always think, well, God is perfect and God wants me to change according to, so much of evangelical theology and also so much of what Dane taught me. So if I'm not changing and God is perfect, the problem's not God. The problem's obviously me. And again, when you see yourself as a problem, that's a problem. And that's when the shame really kicked in, where all of a sudden I was really realizing, well, God's perfect. I'm not. God's unchanging. I'm, also not changing in this sense. So therefore, I'm the problem. I'm the issue. And so that guilt turned into shame, and that shame turned into self-hatred. That self-hatred turned into a lot of really negative sort of, a very negative relationship I had with myself for quite some time. Granted, again, I would like to think at this point things have changed for me, and perhaps there are some residual, negative emotions attached. However, I would say that I think I'm decently adjusted. Maybe I'm just deceiving myself. That's for a therapist to figure out. But all this to say
Yeah.
is that for me, again, the shame wasn't in the moment. The shame was the enduring fruit of my time in conversion therapy. And that's the case for a number of people, but not for everyone. Like you said, a lot of people do feel shamed in the moment. And it's something that, again, is not just in the moment, it lasts for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. What was the major tipping points for you that finally let you say, I don't believe that being gay is wrong?
So for me, I always say that grad school saved my life. I went and did my master's in English afterwards. And I remember that was really just a transitionary period, because I went and did my master's in theological studies after that. And when I was in my master's program, my first master's program, I was, I was reading, texts and voices and authors and talking to people who I'd never really talked to in an academic sense. Like, obviously I'd talked to friends and, family who weren't Christians, but never in an academic sort of setting. And so doing that for the first time, I was having conversations that were so different from, the conversations I had theretofore. And so I started, hearing other people's opinions that were very different from mine. I started to question some of my own deeply held and personally, my personal beliefs. And, being exposed to voices that were very different. I mean, even just reading Jewish authors who have no problem protesting God. And it's funny that Protestants are called Protestants because they're supposed to protest, but they're really protesting the Catholic Church, not God. Yeah. And so I was reading these authors who were like fighting with God. And I'm like, who are you? Like, who do you think you are, like, author? And, realizing
it's like the book of Job, basically.
Exactly. Taking like the biblical model, right? And so I started reading these different voices and I was blown away. And so then there's the folks who I was reading when it was coming, different authors who were approaching gendered sexuality. I'd never read these texts. I'd never come in contact with these arguments. And so that for me was really, really helpful. And I think for me, ultimately, the one of the breaking points, not the breaking, but one of the breaking points was, I remember I was sitting in a Hebrew Bible class and I'm sitting there listening to this professor speak. And all of a sudden I realized, I don't believe that the Bible is God's word. I think these are words about God. And for those outside of, evangelical world, that probably sounds like the smallest difference, but for those within, it is a terrifying difference.
It's everything. You would have thought that the Bible's perfect. It's God's will. It's it's inerrant. And now you're seeing it as a human product. That's a huge shift as a religious believer, for sure.
And it changes so much. And so, it frees you up in a lot of ways, right? Like, it frees you from the necessity to take everything in there as gospel truth in like a literal sense, like God, like good news truth. So I think that for me was this wild moment that really allowed me to change how I lived my life. But even before that, and I did this before I even had that realization, was that I decided that when I moved to Nashville, I moved from Ontario, where I'm from, down to Nashville for theological studies. And when I moved to Nashville, I said to myself, when I get there, I'm not going to put my theology first. Instead, I'm just going to live and then theologize later. So obviously theology at the end of the day really is just theory, right? It's just theory about God and, looking at God through, or the world around us through this like sort of God lens. I was like, I'm going to live my life and then think about God after and see how that works out and see where that takes me.
Yeah.
And again, that's also a terrifying move for an evangelical. And I still don't fully know how I sort of came up with that idea, because to be honest, like, it was not ever within my vocabulary to do that or to think that. But I did, and it changed how I lived my life, obviously, and it changed then in turn what I believed about God. And so as I was going through this rigorous academic program, while at the same time saying, I'm just going to live my life and see where that takes me, it really came together in a way that allowed me freedom from this really constricted and constricting religious community that, ultimately it was my exit out. And thank God it was, because at the end of the day, if I didn't, go to grad school, I think I would probably be married to a woman with children and living an unbelievably unhappy life that would eventually blow up. And, when I just wouldn't be able to take the pressure anymore. And I know folks who from Liberty University or those in conversion therapy who have left that world because they entered that world. Yeah. And I think that I would have been in a very similar path. And I'm just very thankful that that's not where I am.
Do you consider yourself still a religious believer then? Do you have still a practice?
No, I did for up until I was about really like 27 was when I was still clinging on to some sort of religious identity. And I think it's just because I didn't want to give it up fully, though I didn't believe in half the stuff that I used to believe. And for me, I gave up my faith because I couldn't intellectually hold on to it anymore, because realized so many of the inconsistencies within scripture. I realized the historical inaccuracies within scripture. And then on top of that, just like even like a moral or ethical argument, I couldn't understand how there could be a good God who would allow all of the, as we say in the academy, that happens in the world. It just wasn't intellectually or emotionally or morally or ethically honest. And so I had to give it up. And so people, oftentimes will go from one religious tradition to another or one orthodoxy to another. I'd like to think I don't or didn't. Maybe some might say that the academy for me is my new, sort of like spiritual home, but I don't consider it spiritual. I consider it very much intellectual, and ethical. But I don't identify as a spiritual person, and I don't miss it.
That's Luke Wilson. We're talking about the book Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. And Luke is the SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Toronto. And I'm going to mispronounce this. Mississauga, I think is that right?
You did it perfectly.
Yes, I did it. Okay, yes, University of Toronto Mississauga. Okay, well, we've talked a lot about religion, but what people might not know is that conversion therapy grew out of scientific ideas. It wasn't just religion that kind of came up with these ideas. And during the 19th century, as you talk about in the book, people came to see homosexuality, the term they used at the time, as an abnormal human desire. So they knew that it existed, that some men were attracted to other men, some women were attracted to other women, weren't necessarily thinking in terms of trans or other gender identities, just sexual attraction. And so they thought if this is some sort of medical or natural abnormality, then there must be some kind of cure for it. And so they came up with different surgeries. They came up with things of like, we're going to inject bull semen into your testicles or something. Like these different medical procedures. They weren't necessarily religious. Some of these doctors were religious themselves, but they were thinking of it in terms of science, right? And then there was a psychological turn. We need to take on psychoanalysis. We need to use psychotherapy to do this. And it wasn't until the 70s that religion kind of really hopped on board. You mentioned Exodus as one of the main groups that did this. But they, at that time, started to want to adopt those scientific methods just as they were falling out of favor with the science. Take us to that moment and what you see the shift being there between the science and religion of it.
Yeah, so 1970s, really the first ex-gay group within an ecclesial or religious context was in Australia. But in the US specifically, this is happening in Southern California. So Southern California, there are a few different organizations that start cropping up in the early 70s into the mid 70s. By 76, that's when Exodus forms. And so what we find is that when these different organizations are cropping up, they are using, in the beginning, a spiritual approach to changing one's sexual orientation, right? They're really relying. Remember those? I don't know if you come from a religious background, Blair, but remember, fully rely on God, frog, those bracelets that all the Christian kids would wear, and so they were fully relying on God.
Yeah, see, I'm Mormon, so we missed out on all the evangelical stuff. We had our own, like, choose the right. The CTR ring was what we had.
Oh gosh, that sounds like fun.
Yeah.
So they were frogging it. They were fully relying on God, but the problem was that they were a smaller community and they weren't really outside of the religious community. And again, these are conservative religious communities.
So not plugged into science. Yeah.
Not yet, right?
Probably skeptical of. Yeah.
We're still waiting for them to plug into science, and we think that might change them eventually. But here we are.
Yeah.
So 70s are, they formed the Exodus. It's this network of different ex-gay groups across, at this point, it started to be not just within Southern California, but other places. And again, the movement starts building up momentum. We get into the 80s, and the 80s is when they really start trying to use science. And again, I use science very loosely to back up their beliefs. And again, what they were looking for was credibility, right? They wanted to have some sort of scientific backing to say, hey, look, so-and-so with a PhD agrees with us and verifies what we're saying and legitimates what we're saying. And so they're looking for legitimacy.
There's cultural validation. Yeah.
Right. And so on the other side of things, for those who were these quote unquote, researchers, ex-gay researchers, and these, PhDs who were lending their support to these groups, they were also, it became a symbiotic relationship between these two groups, right? So you have the people who are saying we need the science to back it up, and then the quote unquote scientists or researchers who are using these organizations and these groups of people to really get money, right? So one's getting money, the other one's getting legitimacy, quote unquote, and it becomes a symbiotic relationship. And so Moberly is one Christian psychologist Elizabeth Moberly, and she's lending her, writings and research to this group. Later on, when we get into, I believe, the 90s, NARTH is formed. If I'm not mistaken, it's the 90s. I could be wrong, and I can go and check that later. But Joseph Nicolosi, and he eventually becomes the leader of this group. And these are different organizations that, again, are trying to offer some sort of credibility to these groups. And so what we see is that these two groups are really feeding off each other. And again, we can see why they're feeding off each other. And again, all of the research or quote unquote science that this fringe group of scientists, they're very much fringe, like the scientific community does not respect them, never will. These different organizations are really trying their best to, again, make it seem as if what they're saying is true, what they're saying is accurate, but it's not. And it's consistently debunked over and over and over. But this is when the Christian right really latches on to the scientific community as a way of legitimizing their crackpot ideas. But of course, it's just not accurate.
It's so interesting to see them picking up these so-called scientific methods just as they had basically been disproven by the scientific methods. So when therapists and psychologists were trying to work on gay people, I mean, being gay was in the DSM. It was like a diagnosis of a human defect, right? They ended up taking that out, not because of social pressure, like gay people saying, there's nothing wrong with us, stop trying to whatever. They did it because the practices they were trying to do were like harming people. So the actual outcomes of these attempted scientific practices had been thoroughly discredited around the time then that Christian organizations started adopting them for credibility. Let's talk about some of the consequences, some of the outcomes that have been documented and proven. What happens to people when they go through conversion therapy? What kind of adverse effects does this so-called therapy have on people?
Well, there are many effects, including, right, we've talked about a few of them, guilt. The effect is gay. No, they were already gay. The effect is guilt, shame. We've talked about, there's depression, there's anxiety, there's increased risk for suicidal ideation, there's increased risk for homelessness. There are numerous psychological, spiritual effects. We can talk about that, right? There are spiritual harms that have been documented in different approaches to that.
Yeah, talk about the moral injury part of it. That's something that I think gets overlooked a lot.
So moral injury, right? It's this idea that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of this as a function of conversion practices, but moral injury is when you have implicated yourself in the victimization of others, right? And how you feel based on that, right? Like I can think of the number of, it wasn't too many, but there were people I was pushing in the direction of, if they were gay, saying like there's I didn't use the term conversion therapy because that wasn't in my vocabulary at the time, but saying like pushing them in the direction like there's an exit for this. There's possibility for hope. There's possibility for victory in Jesus. We can overcome this. And I can think of a number of my friends who at Liberty, when it did come out that we were, both struggling with same-sex attraction, quote unquote, the phrase that oftentimes evangelicals use. In other words, we're gay. Would push them in the direction of like righteousness, quote unquote. Even in the story that I talk about in same-sex attraction, right? Where what happened between that guy and I that I write about.
You would basically you really kind of were drawn to each other. And when you went away for the summer, you would tell it, you'd sort of like, I don't remember what software you were using.
Skype.
Was it Zoom?
It was Skype.
It was Skype. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. May it rest in peace. It just has now died. But so you're Skyping and you'd have these sort of like hold each other accountable, but also kind of flirting with each other. Like it was kind of this little romance that you had. Years later, you saw you saw him on Facebook. I think he's married and in a mixed orientation marriage and maybe in the closet. And it was a sweet little romance. Yeah,
it was a sweet romance. But I think the other part of it, right, is that it's the moral injury, right? That I was pushing him toward what he ultimately chose, which was forced heteronormative monogamy in the context of a quote unquote straight marriage. He's not straight. His wife, I believe, is. But it's this, again, that's moral injury where I pushed this guy to go towards that. At the end of the day, yes, I understand that he has full autonomy to make that decision or not.
Sure.
But that's an example of moral injury, right? Where I pushed him. I was complicit in his victimization. I was complicit in my own victimization, right?
Yeah.
But I think that that's what we're talking about when we're talking about spiritual harm, right? And that's at least one component of it. Some people have PTSD, right? Where I know one guy and his experiences, like his lived experience, or it was like how he lives his life on a day-to-day basis, in so many ways goes back to his experience in conversion therapy. It's what he constantly thinks about. And again, that's one
Yeah.
example of many. And, there are also physical harms, right? Some people who have undergone electroshock therapy and aversion therapy, this kind of stuff, like there's that. There's, humiliation for what they did. I still think to myself, like, to be honest, when I first came out as a conversion therapy survivor, I didn't think about how this was going to be how people would see me. And I again, so much of my life is not conversion therapy. That was 4 years of my life.
Yeah.
And I would like to think I'm a well-rounded person. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm a one-trick pony, but who knows? So, but the thing is that people see you like that. And then people start looking at you with those eyes, right? They look at you like, oh, like you're such a victim, or you're like, I feel bad for you, that sort of like pity.
Yeah.
And it's not a fun feeling, right? Like I still to this day think like, gosh, like I don't want people to see me as a victim. I know that I was victimized. I know that what happened to me was wrong, but like there's that as well. So these are just some examples, some anecdotal, some based on, peer-reviewed research, but all of this to say that conversion therapy results in a multiplicity of consequences, and they are negative, right? Like these are things that in some cases lead to people's death. And I think that what we have to understand, again, like I said, you shouldn't have to go to therapy if you underwent therapy, but this is abuse. This is something that takes advantage of vulnerable people in high control religious contexts, oftentimes, not always, and particularly youth, but if not, youth, people oftentimes in their 20s and 30s, but it goes beyond that. And what happens is these folks have to deal with a number of death-dealing consequences, and in some cases, literally death-dealing consequences because of their time in conversion therapy.
As I was reading the stories in your book that you collected, there were some similar patterns. I mean, all of them were told there was something wrong with them. All of them talked about shame and humiliation of that. Then a cure is offered to them, and then the cure starts hurting, and then they reach a breaking point, and then they shift away from and try to shift into recovery away from that. But for all those similarities, they're also very individual stories. It was interesting to see the range of different experiences. As you were putting the book together and gathering these stories, are there any that really stood out to you, surprised you, any that you kind of think back on?
There are different stories that stand out for different reasons. One story that really stands out is Nathan Z's story, Away and Away. And his story, he underwent conversion practices in the context of his home with his parents, specifically his mom. And she was from what he describes as a Chinese cult. And so, reading his story and the high control sort of nature of his domestic life was awful, right? Like every aspect of his life was controlled, and anything that he, his exit out from that world was really, he had to find a way to carve out a path that allowed him out of his home. And it felt like sort of like this like escape story. But throughout that time that he was at home, his mom was trying to change his sexual orientation. And for me, it was one story of many that really expanded how I understand conversion practices, that it's not, again, just what we think of when we think of conversion therapy and like Garrett Conling's Boy Erase, which is phenomenal. And we're standing on his shoulders. And he's one survivor whose story really pushed the narrative of how damaging conversion therapy is in the mainstream. But rolling back and going into the collection, thinking about Nathan's story, that for me was wild because I just hadn't really thought about, how ubiquitous conversion practices can be and are, and that, it expanded my understanding of conversion practices. Not just that I underwent conversion therapy at Liberty, and not just that Nathan underwent conversion therapy in the context of his home, but both of us underwent, and I would ultimately argue every queer experiences conversion practices in a broader sense, right? Any one of us who were told as a kid, don't sit like that, you look like a don't sit like that, you look like a little boy. Don't play with that toy. You sound gay when you talk like this. Whatever it might be. Oh, you're not going to watch Drag Race. Or you're not going to watch America's Next Top Model, whatever it might be, right? That these are conversion practices. These are direct or indirect messaging that communicates to us it's not okay to be us. We have to align ourselves with the heteronormative script. And so with that, Nathan's story really expanded my understanding of conversion practices, because I was like, oh, it's not just that formal setting. It's in many ways also the informal messaging that we receive throughout our lives. And so that's another story that I would say really stands out.
Yeah, that reminded me of one that stood out to me. The name they go by in the book is D. Apple, and they were kind of this perfectionist homeschooled kid. And she basically talks about wanting to perform conversion therapy on herself. She was like the main conversion therapist in her story. Part of the problem is she saw no role models in her life of gay people. Like being gay was just wrong. Being homeschooled, she was very controlled. She lived in this bubble and tried to conversion therapy herself, which, yeah, that came as a surprise. Like, oh yeah, this conversion therapy can happen because you're meeting with a therapist or meeting with a pastor or meeting or family members are doing this. But in her case, it was like her.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing that oftentimes, like, we have, a quote unquote conversion therapist, and I always put like I always love evangelicalism or just this topic in general. It's you have to put quotes around everything, like conversion therapist, like everything needs quotes. But for her, when she becomes her own conversion therapist, I think a lot of us had become our own conversion therapists after we left conversion therapy, right? Like we were supposed to be the perpetuators of this mindset, this ideology, and these practices, that we were the ones to go out and do this to ourselves later once we no longer were with our conversion therapist. And again, this goes into the gay community, the queer community, should I say more broadly, the LGBTQ community, that we all became our own jailers. We all became our own monitors of our gender expression and identity, and also our sexual orientation. We were forced into sort of policing ourselves, right? And we were all forced into changing how we act, how we are, and what we feel, or trying to at least. Most of us were very unsuccessful. And by that, I mean, we're all very unsuccessful, at least in the orientation change. Maybe in how we express our gender, we had to sort of like find techniques or methods to mask that where we pass.
Right.
But obviously in every other case, we're not, like our actual identity and orientation, blah, blah, blah. So what I will say is that what we see with Dee's story is that she was her own conversion therapist. But again, I think that if we are to zoom out, we see that everyone really has to become at some level their own conversion therapist who underwent conversion therapy. And then in a broader sense, that so many queers really became their own because they were pushed into that. And it's always funny when people talk about this idea of like, oh, I wanted to change, or people will say like, I wanted to become straight.
Right.
And it's like, none of us wanted to become straight. None of us wanted to be anything other than what we are, but we're pushed to wanting, and we're made to want, these things because we're told for so long, this is disgusting, this is dirty, this is damaging, this is going to fuck you up, this is going to send you to hell. And of course, we don't want to go to hell. We don't want to be gross and dirty and seen as other by other people.
Yeah.
And so although, people became their own conversion therapists, although people went to conversion therapy, although they said that they wanted this, it was really because they were made to want this. And it was this sort of like cruel optimism that one could change. And then of course one never changes. And so I think that's something that's really important to note.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is that so many of the stories resist a tidy ending. Like they don't sew everything up and make us feel all better. The stories often leave us hanging. So we get to see a picture of what it was like for people during a part of their story. Tell me about that decision to kind of leave readers uncomfortable and not resolve everything for us.
Yeah. So I actually, some of the stories had different endings, and I worked with authors to make sure that we cut those endings off, not in the sense to say this didn't happen or I was changing their narrative. No, I was simply putting a frame on their narrative. So, for me, I could have talked about how I grew up on 84 Glenmount Park Road, which is true, but I didn't include that in the story. Does that mean that my story is no longer sort of valid or accurate?
Right.
No, it is. I just didn't include that narrative or that part of the narrative. And so for them, I said, okay, let's start here and we're going to end here. Why? Exactly like you said, to leave readers in that state of uncomfortability. I wanted in some small way to leave readers where they have to sit with the weight of what happened to the author. Again, they're never going to know what it's like to go through their experience because they weren't there and they never will go through that. However, in some small way, I wanted readers to sit in that uncomfortability and say, okay, I know that me as a human, I think it's a pretty human thing for us to want that sort of narrative resolution. We want at the end of a story for there to be a bow on it and everything to be fine and, God to be on our throne and the rest be, whatever good. However, that's not how the story ended for a lot of people, right? Like, yes, maybe down the road, eventually they got to a point where they are in a better place. And in fact, all of the authors who were included in the collection did get to a better place. And we know that in part by the fact that they submitted their stories and the fact that, they're here. Yeah.
They're still here.
And so that part isn't taken out. And I never wanted to indicate or to make it seem as if these authors, live now in like abject sort of misery. In fact, from my understanding, none of them do, but all of them are quite successful and, doing their thing and living their queer lives, which is great. However, I wanted readers to not to be sort of like satisfied at the end, because for those of us who went through, we weren't satisfied.
Oh, it all worked out.
You know what I mean? And it's like, yes, it did work out for us down the road, but I want people to know that for a very long time, it didn't, right? For a very long time, it was incredibly difficult. For a very long time, it was, miserable to be us, in part because of our experience in conversion therapy, and also for a lot of people because of their religious, sort of environments. But I think that editorial decision really spoke to my desire for people to have some small window into conversion practices and to sit with the weight or the extremity of what folks went through and not have that resolution, because again, for us, it wasn't resolved for quite some time.
Yeah. And I like how you called it that small window. So not only small in terms of the sort of frame that you put around it, but you also mentioned in the book that there are representational shortcomings. Like there's a pretty broad range here, but you also say you wish you had more people of color, or you wish there's some trans representation here, but this is a book that you'd like to see as a beginning of a conversation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, what happened was with the collection, I put out a call for folks who would be interested in submitting a story. And at the end of the day, you could only include the stories that are submitted. And so for me, the stories that were submitted were the stories that were included in the collection, plus a few others that I ultimately didn't select. But, I wish there were more, voices that were different from the majority. The majority in the collection are from high control conservative Christian contexts. But there's one secular context, there is one Orthodox Jewish context, there is one from this Chinese cult. And so for me, I would, again, I've loved a broader range and a broader diversity of voices, but at the end of the day, you can only really include what's submitted. But I think that what's important to note is that people of color are disproportionately affected by conversion practices in comparison to white folks. And so that's something that I wanted to note. And I noted at the very end of the collection in the afterword, which was initially in the introduction, but it was actually moved to the afterword. It was not my choice, but neither here nor there. Just want to make that clear.
Call them out. Call out your editors. Tell.
They were great. It was just that was one thing I didn't agree with, but who am I? And so at the end of the day, the stories in there, they do provide a variety of narratives, but they also I wish that we could have more. And there's no stories that are from Muslim context, and we know that there are a number of conversion practices going on in Muslim context. I wish that we could have had more, and maybe that's the next collection, maybe that's the revised edition. But for now, we have the stories that are included, and again, I think that the stories that are included are so well told. And I'm so thankful for the voices that are in the collection, because the folks in there are just fabulous.
Ultimately, what do you think about the power of stories? Why is telling the stories an important part of opposing conversion therapy practices? Like, why not just point to the science and the stats? Like, we can show, here's how it harms, here's the statistics, it's not a successful practice, we can use our rational brains. You're wanting us to enter the life of people. What does that do for us?
I am a literary critic, which sounds like I criticize literature, but that's not really what I do. Instead, I read literature, I read stories for a living, and I talk about, different themes and different sort of like trees that we can pull out from these pieces of literature. And these pieces of literature that I research are I think, super important, because they teach us a lot about sexuality. They teach a lot about gender. They teach, and for me, I've done a lot of my past research was actually in intergenerational trauma, and so we can learn a lot from stories. Granted, if I'm reading a study, a study about like epigenetics, or if I'm reading a study about I don't know, sexual abuse, that's one thing, and that's one approach, and I think that's super important and super necessary. But if I'm trying to change people's minds, I'm not coming with necessarily the facts and figures in the same way that I would bring a story. I think that stories have such an emotional and an affective valence that allow for a different way of meeting someone where they're at. You can tell someone all day long that conversion practices are harmful. But if I show you, as opposed to telling you that conversion practices are harmful, that's a different approach. And
yeah, if you take us to the guy huddled in the closet with a bag of dog crap, smelling it, and when he thinks about men, and how often he had to do that for, and how that guy, I think, was going through conversion therapy for like 25 years or something.
Went through a long
That's
time.
different than, you're right. Like the stats and all that matters. But when we have to think about sitting in a closet with dog shit in a bag, it's a little bit different.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? I think that there's a creative writing principle. It says show, don't tell. And so instead of telling someone I'm ashamed, and of course the title Shame, Sex, Attraction, even the cover itself has this person covering their face. What we do when we are ashamed, we avert our eyes, we look down, we cover our face, right? The countenance, we want to hide our personhood, and oftentimes how we understand our personhood is, or the concentration thereof, is our face. And so showing someone, covering their face versus saying I'm ashamed, those are two different things. And so I think that the reason why that is the case and why we do that is really for that emotional experience. And so, why do we watch movies? Why do we watch TV? Why do we read books? We do it because we can, again, all these movies, books, and TV shows are teaching us a lot about a lot of things, but we learn in a different way by consuming art. And this is art. This is not an academic approach to the topic. This is art. These are narratives. These are literary accounts of what happened. And so I think that for me speaks to that, again, that affective level where we engage with texts, and whether that be a film, a TV show, or a book, we engage with these texts very differently than we do the facts and the figures. And again, there are times and places for those facts and figures, but there's also a time for those emotional texts that really bring up a lot within us that I think can change people's minds in a different way. Granted, am I saying that this collection is going to change people's minds about conversion therapy? No, I don't think that even this book will ever make it into those people's hands that should be reading this book, whose minds I would hope would change. However, if it's that one person who reads this collection and says, oh, geez, I see, either myself in this, or I see how I've been complicit in this, whatever it might be, that's, I think, at the end of the day, a goal that's worthy of having.
If you can't convert any of the conversion therapists, you're at least offering some catharsis and recognition, I think, for people who have been through it. And even that, I think, would be enough just for people to feel seen and connecting with others who've experienced what they're experiencing.
That's it. Yeah. And I think that for me really is much more of a goal than changing people's minds. I know I have no illusion that, again, any conversion therapist is going to read this, that really, like, any evangelical is going to read this. I hope that everyone buys this book and sends it to their local church. I think that'd be kind of the most hilarious thing ever. But putting that aside, and that goal is, putting that goal aside, I think that for me, I'm more optimistic about is that when folks who have undergone conversion practices read this book, or those who don't even know that they underwent conversion practices read this book, and then all of a sudden see themselves and say, oh gosh, I resonate with this, I see myself here. That's for me really the goal. Again, yes, I would love for people to change their minds. But I'm a pessimist, and I don't believe that that's going to happen. And so I think more realistically, it's going to be that queers, specifically those who underwent conversion practices, read this and see themselves and find, again, some sort of catharsis or resonate in some way.
That's Lucas Wilson. We're talking about his book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. And Lucas is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Toronto Mississauga. All right, we always like to end and wrap things up with regrets, challenges, and surprises, Luke. So I'm going to ask you if there's anything, now that the book, this is a brand new book, is there anything that you, maybe we already kind of spoke that. You wanted more representation. So regrets, maybe, I think we kind of covered that. Were there any challenges or surprises that you want to highlight in the process of making this particular book? What the most challenging thing was, or what surprised you in the course of making it?
I think maybe I could name two challenges. One being that, when you work with authors, I taught for like 10 years at the college and university level, which I don't miss, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
Yeah.
That job was a thankless job. That job was a job that you've constantly felt, once grades were involved, it just felt like an uphill battle because students want an easy A and they don't want to work for it. And then you get blamed for that not doing well. And you're like, that's not how this works. But I think that when I was working on these stories, again, it wasn't like teaching, because thank God I wasn't grading anyone here. And so it took away that weird tension that always sort of is inherent to, engaging with folks' work that way. So it was very different, thank God, in that sense. But that wasn't the challenge. The challenge was that you're not only like engaging with writing, you're engaging with very personal writing that has oftentimes a lot of traumatic sort of resonances, right?
Yeah.
And so working with people and having to really make clear that when we're working together and workshopping this piece, because it often took anywhere from 3 to 6 rounds of edits with folks, and really detailed edits working with authors, having to really differentiate, say, hey, your writing is not you. It certainly is a product of you. It's a reflection of you in a lot of ways, but it's not you.
Yeah.
And my job here is not to change the story or the content, because that's simply not my job. My job instead is to make sure that the form and how you tell the story is really as great as it can be and as strong as it can be. And so let's work there. And so most contributors were like A-okay with edits, and they had done this before, and this was that, or that was that. But there were some where we had to sort of negotiate and navigate that space of saying, hey, this isn't you. Let's make sure that that I think you're phenomenal. I think your writing is phenomenal, but let's just bring it up to the next level. And so that was certainly a challenge.
Yeah.
Again, not a big challenge, but a challenge. And it was also, it's a fun process too, right? I think it's great when you're able to work with someone to make their, in this case, artistic sort of, output as great as it can be. So that was phenomenal.
Yeah.
As well as a challenge, but again, it was also very fun.
Yeah. The book, again, is Shame, Sex, Attraction, and it's been really cool talking to you about it. I appreciate you taking the time, Luke.
Blair, thank you so much for having me on the show. This has been too much fun.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Relationscapes. If this is your first episode, welcome. I hope you'll check out some of the other discussions on the show. There's a lot of different topics to choose from. And I hope you'll take a second to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. I notice, I say this in pretty much every episode. I invite people to do this, but it's usually not until I post about it on social media that I'll get some new reviews. So listeners, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from people who just listen. You're not necessarily following me on social media. Let's hear what you have to say about the show. Also, you should follow me on social media if you're there. Instagram is kind of the main place where I'm at. And of course, you can also rate the show in Spotify. Mates of State provides our theme song. I'm your host, Blair Hodges, a journalist here in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you again soon.